Hello viewers, welcome to my channel. I'm Hashim Ali Khan. So now in this video I'm going to explain you a very important topic, that is the doctrine of caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. So presently the lectures are going on the Sale of Goods Act 1930 in the subject business law. So last 3 videos I have completed on the meaning of the term contract of sale. What are the essentials for a valid contract of sale? I have explained you the differences between sale and agreement to sell. What are goods? What are the different types of goods? What are conditions and warranties? Differences between conditions, warranties, implied conditions and implied warranties. These are the things already I have completed in the last 3 videos. Hope my regular viewers have already watched those videos. If you have not watched, I suggest you to go to the playlist of my channel. Select the subject business law. Select the topic Sale of Goods Act. Definitely you will get a lot of confidence on the subject of Sale of Goods Act 1930. Now, in this video, I am going to explain you doctrine of caveat emptor. So very frequently in examination, they may ask you the question regarding explain the doctrine of caveat emptor and what are its exceptions. So watch the video till the end. I am explaining you about caveat emptor. The doctrine of caveat emptor is a Latin term. In Latin term, it is doctrine of caveat emptor. When we convert it into English, it is let the buyer beware. The meaning of caveat emptor is let the buyer beware. Always the seller will not be at the fault. Sometimes the buyer will also be at fault, because the buyer has to be conscious while buying the goods. He has to apply his own checks. That means the doctrine of caveat emptor is a very important and integral part of the Sale of Goods Act. Now, this doctrine informs that the contract of sale of goods, the seller is under no duty to reveal unflattering truth about the goods sold. That means the seller is not completely bound. It is not his duty to explain each and everything about the goods sold. That means the buyer should also be aware. The buyer should be conscious about the goods being bought. Now, therefore, when a person buys some goods, he must examine them thoroughly, because he is the buyer. So he should not be blind. He should carefully see, thoroughly he has to check the goods, and then only he should buy. So if the goods turn out to be defective or do not suit his purpose, he cannot blame except himself. That means he only knows for what purpose he is buying the goods. Later on, if he finds that the seller has given the goods which is not fit for my purpose, so how come the seller can be able to know what is your purpose? So in that case, the blame should be given only to buyer himself. The seller is not to be blamed, because he has to check thoroughly before purchasing the goods. He has to see whether the goods are suitable for his purpose or not. Now, according to section 16 of the Sale of Goods Act, it says, subject to the provisions of this act or any other law time being in force, for any other law for the time being in force, there is no implied warranty or condition as to the quality or fitness for any particular purpose. There is no implied guarantee, there is no implied warranty, and there is no implied condition on the part of the seller that he has to supply only those goods which are suitable for the purpose of the buyer. The buyer knows, the buyer must know for what purpose he is buying the goods. So it is not the complete responsibility of the seller. It is the responsibility of the buyer to check the quality and to check the suitability of the goods which he is buying. Then a seller, here I am giving one example. A seller makes his goods available in the market. The buyer previous all options, and then accordingly makes his choice. The buyer previews all his options and accordingly makes his choice. When a buyer goes to the market, so many goods, so many sellers are available. Every seller is selling different type of goods. It is the responsibility of the buyer to see which goods suits his requirement. suits his purpose. So the sellers will not know. The buyer must know for what purpose he is buying the goods. Now let's assume that the product turns out to be defective or inferior quality. After buying the goods, if the product turns out to be not suitable for his purpose, then the seller will not be responsible for this. The buyer himself is responsible for the choice he has made. In that case, if he has selected a wrong item which does not suit his purpose, then he alone is liable. He should not be blindly purchase the goods. He should not completely depend on the seller only. He has to check thoroughly himself. Then so the doctrine attempts to make the buyer more conscious of his choices. So this doctrine of caveat emptor stresses that the buyer should be more cautious while making the choice, while selecting the goods, while buying the goods. He should be more cautious. Then it is the duty of the buyer to check the quality and the usefulness of the product he is purchasing. What is the quality? Whether it will be useful or not for me, he has to check himself. If the product turns out to be defective, the seller will not be responsible for this. For the seller will not be responsible for this if he makes a wrong choice. But there are exceptions to this caveat emptor also. I will discuss. Now, with the help of an example, I am going to explain you about caveat emptor. The example is A bought a horse from B. A bought a horse from B. A wanted to use the horse in a race. That means the intention of A is to buy a horse and use that horse in a racing purpose. Now, the horse was not capable of running in the races as it is a lame horse. After buying the horse, when he was using it for racing purpose, the horse was not capable of running because the horse was lame horse. Then, but A did not inform B of his intentions. So before buying the horse, A has not told to B that I want a horse for the purpose of using it in racing. He has not disclosed. He has not told to the supplier. Then, so B will not be responsible for the defects of the horse. The doctrine of caveat emptor will apply. In this case, B is not responsible. Who is to be blamed? A himself has to be blamed. So when he is buying the horse, he should be careful. Otherwise, he should have told to the supplier of the horse that I want a horse for the purpose of using in the racing. So the horse should be capable of to use in racing. He should have told to the supplier. He have not told. That means B has not told to A that I need a horse for racing purpose. Simply he has purchased the horse. Later on he found that the horse is incapable. Now doctrine of caveat emptor will apply. Seller is not responsible. Only the buyer himself is responsible. That's all. So this is the example of caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Buyer also should be conscious while buying the goods. Always the blame cannot be given only to the seller. Now, exception to the doctrine of caveat emptor. This is a rule. Caveat emptor is a rule. But always 100% this rule will not be applied. There are some cases where caveat emptor exceptions are there. That means those cases where seller will be made responsible, not buyer. Seller will be made responsible. So what are the exceptions? First one, fitness of the product for the buyer's purpose. Fitness of the product. Fitness of the product for the buyer's purpose. So when the buyer is buying some goods, he is buying for a particular purpose. This purpose was already told to the seller. The purpose why he is buying the goods, the purpose has been told to the seller, and the buyer is relying on the judgment of the seller. In that case, the caveat emptor will not apply, because it is the responsibility of the seller to supply the goods which is for the purpose of the buyer. So this is the exception. So here, when the buyer informs the seller of his purpose of buying the goods, it is implied that he is relying on seller's judgment. So it is a duty of the seller to ensure that goods match with their desired usage. So when the buyer has told to the seller that I need this product for this purpose, then it is the responsibility of the seller to supply the goods which fits for the purpose. Otherwise, seller will be responsible. This is the first exception. Second exception, in case of sale by description. When the buyer has told to the seller regarding the description of the goods, then it is the responsibility of the seller to sell only those goods which match with the description, correspond with the description. If the buyer has already told the description to the seller, but seller has provided a different product which is not according to the description, in that case seller is responsible. Caveat emptor rule will not apply because the goods supplied is not according to description. So when the goods are sold by the seller does not match with the description of goods, it is regarded as exception to caveat emptor. Just what I told. Now, in case of sale by sample, there are many cases where goods are sold by the seller according to some sample. In that case, the sample should correspond with the bulk. Sample should correspond with the bulk. Suppose if the bulk is not corresponding the sample, not following, not matching with the sample, then seller is responsible. For example, I am the buyer and Mr. X is the seller. I am purchasing a bag of rice. So he has given a sample of rice and telling that this sample is exactly same as that of bag of rice. So relying on the sample, I have purchased the bag. Later on I found that the bag has an inferior quality of rice, whereas the sample is different, bag is different, sample is not corresponding with the bulk. Now in this case, seller is responsible, not the buyer, because the sample does not correspond, the bulk does not correspond with the sample. When the goods are sold by sample and when goods are supplied by seller does not match with the corresponding sample, in such a case, caveat emptor is not applicable, seller is bound. Next one, goods of merchantable quality. Goods should be of merchantable quality, standard quality, better quality. That means according to the market standards, the quality should be good. So the seller who is selling the goods by description and has a duty of providing goods of mercantile quality that is capable of passing the market standard. When the people buys the goods, the goods will be for a particular purpose. Example, when an AC is purchased, the people will buy the AC to make the cooling. If the AC itself is not making the cooling, then what is the purpose of buying the AC? It is not of merchantable quality. So, if the goods are not up to the merchantable quality, seller is responsible. Seller is responsible. So, if the goods are not merchantable quality, then the buyer will not be one who is responsible, it will be the seller's responsibility. However, if the buyer has been given a chance to examine the product, then this exception will not apply. In some cases, what will happen? The seller has given a chance to the buyer to inspect yourself. Be satisfied with yourself and then only you purchase it. So it is the responsibility of the buyer to carefully, thoroughly inspect, examine the product. If it is sound, then only he should purchase. Next one, last one is fraud or misrepresentation by the seller. Sometimes the seller will make a fraud, misrepresentation to the buyer. Why he is making fraud? To induce the buyer to buy the goods. Example, X is the seller. Y is the buyer. X has misrepresented the goods to Y so that Y should buy the goods. In that case, even after inspecting, the fraud cannot be known, the misrepresentation cannot be known. So in that case, seller is responsible. The caveat emptor principle will not apply. This is another important exception. If the seller obtains the consent of the buyer by fraud, that means the seller is inducing the buyer to buy the goods on the basis of fraud, then caveat emptor rule will not apply. Also, if the seller conceals any material defect of the goods which are later discovered on closer examination, one defect is there. That defect was not, disclosed by the seller. Some hidden defect was there. It is the responsibility of the seller to disclose if there is any defect, but he has not disclosed the defect. So through fraudulently he has taken the consent of the buyer, or by not showing a defect in the product, in that case, then again the buyer will not be responsible. In both cases, the seller will be guilty party. So in both the cases, that means if the seller makes a fraud or if the seller makes a misrepresentation, that means if there is a clear defect but the defect has not been disclosed by the seller, in both these cases the buyer is not responsible. Caveat emptor rule will not apply. Seller is responsible. The seller is guilty of supplying the goods. So in this video I have explained you about caveat emptor. Let the buyer beware. Always the buyer should be careful while buying the goods. So he should not blame always the seller is at fault. No. The law says even it is the buyer's responsibility to check, inspect thoroughly, and then you purchase. So this is the doctrine of caveat emptor and some exceptions to the rule where caveat emptor principle will not apply. Seller is responsible. That's all. So if you are satisfied with my lecture, give a like to the video. Share my channel in your group, in your friend circle, so that more students can watch the video and enhance the knowledge. Give your comments on these videos. And lastly, don't forget to subscribe my channel if you have not yet subscribed. Inshallah, next topic on this Sale of Goods Act will continue in the next video.